All right, everybody, welcome back. We are continuing this week to Module 11, Dietary Energy and Respiration. So in our previous lecture, we were discussing how nutrients become energy. And we were discussing metabolism and the cellular processes that allow us to extract energy from our diet. And this week, we're going to sort of continue in that vein, and we're going to understand even more how our body processes different forms of energy and the different types of energy that are made available at the cellular level. So, your book this week saw this through the lens of examining obesity in the United States and understanding how nutrients essentially contribute to obesity and how it is stored. Um, but I really wanted to, instead of sort of focusing on, the measurement of BMI and how culturally or physically the U.S. is getting more obese, I want you to really focus in on the cellular processes that are at work here. So, the first driving question that we're really going to be examining is how the body uses energy in food. Again, understanding how food from proteins, carbohydrates, and fats then becomes cellular energy. The next process, and really the big one that we're going to be focusing on, is how does aerobic respiration extract energy from food? Aerobic respiration is really the primary driving force of how cells obtain and create energy from food. And then lastly, we're going to talk about another process called fermentation, which is another driving force to get energy from food. And we're going to understand a little bit why it can't sustain human life. So again, in your book this week, we examined this question of why are people getting heavier globally, and this is in fact a global process, not one um, that's specifically restricted to the United States. So we've seen that global obesity rates have actually doubled since 1980. So again, this is a huge public health issue that is being examined by both chronic disease epidemiologists and even infectious disease epidemiologists, and understanding how obesity can interact with different infectious diseases. Um, an obvious example that is happening right now is that people who are obese tend to have worse outcomes with COVID. So again, this is a multi-layered and multifaceted uh, section in health that is increasingly getting more and more prevalent, even in developing countries. But really, there are two prime reasons why people are getting heavier. There's the biology. So we know that evolution has driven our bodies to adapt to famine. So we store extra food as fat. So this is really the overarching goal of how we as humans preserve and store energy. And we've adapted essentially because in our evolutionary history, we've had to adapt to famine. People who were able to store extra food as fat tended to survive longer. So we, again, inherited this trait. And the other fact that is obviously contributing to obesity is culture. In other words, how we eat and how much we eat. And an easy sort of example, if a bit limiting, is understanding, is looking at portion sizes in the US compared to other countries in Europe. And you can see that there's dramatic differences in the nutritional content available in each of the different countries. But again, so where we're focusing this week is understanding cellularly what is happening in terms of how we get and store energy. So, why does eating food lead to weight gain? And we're going to be really examining this at a cellular level. So, food is not only just a source of nutrition. So, as we sort of discussed previously, why micronutrients are important for different processes in the body, but It's also really its primary source is energy and the power to do work in the body. So you've probably come across the term calories before, but what does that actually mean scientifically? So a calorie, lowercase c, is the amount of energy that is required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree centigrade. So it's sort of a strange way that metric that we use to understand um, nutritional outtake. But again, thinking about in terms of that this is a way, a metric that we're using to understand the power to do work. And this measurement is essentially the power to do work. So it's the amount of energy required to raise that temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree centigrade. So measuring the amount of power it takes to raise that temperature. And then food energy. Food energy is measured in calories, capital C. And that's really just equal to 1,000 calories, lowercase c, or 1 kilocalorie. And that's how we get to the calories that we're used to seeing, on this in nutritional labels, for example. So let's think about food as a source of energy. So in our previous lectures, we said that sort of all nutrients fall into carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, as well as small portions of amino acids. But what does that mean in terms of our diet and what is happening again at the cellular level? So first, we know that food contains macromolecules, and we examined that in our last lecture of them sort of being complex molecules that then the body processes through enzymes, through metabolism and digestion to extract energy. And so again, these macromolecules are broken down in the body to building blocks or subunits that the cell can then process into other forms of energy. So these new molecules then that have been broken down and built back up into something that the cells can use are what actually powers the cellular processes that take place in our bodies. So this is sort of going back to what we were examining in our previous lectures, where we had carbohydrates and we examined how those are broken down into simple sugars. But now we're able to understand the energy output of such molecules. You can see that that here we can break down of a carbohydrate into 4 calories, again, uppercase C, per gram of energy. And the same thing is true of proteins, fats, and nucleic acids, which we discussed previously. So we see the proteins being broken down into amino acids, we see fats being broken down into fatty acids and glycerol, and we have nucleic acids being broken down into nucleotides. And we see how much energy is derived from each of these different portions of primary macromolecule. So now that we, sort of understand that these macromolecules are being broken down and essentially reused as energy, how do we then get to actually the ability to store energy? And again, this is sort of harkening back to the overall arching question of understanding obesity, is understanding how these different macromolecules and how energy is stored in the body. So there are 2 primary ways that animals store energy. The first is a glycogen in muscle and liver cells, and then triglycerides in fat cells. So let's zoom in and understand what each of those processes actually look like. So glycogen is a complex animal carbohydrate that is made up of linked chains of glucose molecules. Glucose is going to be a really important molecule that we're going to be examining throughout the course of these lectures. And glycogen is used in our body as short-term energy storage. So let's take a look at what that actually looks like. So we have these simple sugars, so glycogen, carbohydrates, and then essentially these simple sugars that are not immediately used for cell energy are then bound together in these branching chains, and this is what we get when we get glycogen. So we're coming from these linked glucose chains into this long chain of glycogen, and then that glycogen is stored short term in muscle and liver tissue. And this is what is used as a quick source of energy when food molecules are unavailable in the bloodstream. So when we don't have energy, um, we can access this sort of quick form of short-term energy storage that are provided from these simple sugars and from glycogen. So now that we've talked about short-term energy storage, let's think about long-term energy storage. And these are things that are coming from, again, these broken down materials of amino acids, fatty acids, and glycerol, and these simple sugars. These, once there's sort of been glycogen stores, again, so our glycogens have already filled us up for short-term energy storage. Excess energy from these dietary carbohydrates, proteins, and fats are then um, reformed into this formation called triglycerides. So you can see we have, and we talked about these in our previous lecture, where we have this structure of a sugar bond and then these fatty acid chains hanging off of them. And these are stored in fat cells, and that is really the primary source of our long-term energy storage. And again, linking it back to this idea of famine, these are how our body has evolved to store these triglycerides in fat, which enables us to survive these long periods of famine. And now, in areas where there's not a lot of famine, you get this idea of storing your body just continues to store these excess this excess nutrition, this excess energy in the fat cells, and that's what you when you see contributing to obesity. But keep in mind that this is sort of a very basic view of understanding the process of obesity. It's a little bit it is oversimplified, but it gives us an idea of understanding how the nutrition we get from food gets then stored in the body and used as energy. So we're going to pick up in our next lecture, understanding then how our body processes this stored energy.